He killed a bear when he was only 3. He fought in Congress, fought at the Alamo, and became America's first celebrity. But everything you think you know about Davy Crockett is probably wrong. This is the true story of the man behind the legend. On August 17, 1786, in a small cabin along the Nolichucky River in what is now Greene County, Tennessee, a boy was born who would become one of America's most enduring folk heroes. His name was David Crockett, though the world would come to know him as Davy. But let's be clear from the start, the Davy Crockett of legend, the man who could grin a coon out of a tree and supposedly killed a bear at age 3, was largely a creation of marketing, politics, and American mythology. The real David Crockett was far more complex, flawed, and ultimately more interesting than the tall tales suggest. David was the 5th of 9 children, born to John and Rebecca Crockett. His father was a Revolutionary War veteran who struggled to make a living on the Tennessee frontier. The Crockett family was poor, constantly moving, constantly struggling. This wasn't the romantic frontier of later stories. This was harsh, brutal survival. John Crockett tried his hand at various enterprises. He ran a grist mill that was destroyed by a flood. He opened a tavern along the road from Abingdon, Virginia to Knoxville, Tennessee. Young David worked in the tavern, serving travelers and listening to their stories. This is where he developed his gift for storytelling and his understanding of how to connect with people, skills that would serve him throughout his life. When David was 12, his father hired him out to a cattle drover named Jacob Seiler to help drive cattle to Virginia, a journey of over 300 miles. For a boy who had barely left his father's tavern, this was an incredible adventure. David would later describe this journey in his autobiography, noting how he learned the ways of the trail and the skills of survival. The journey taught young David essential frontier skills. He learned to read the weather, to find water, to keep cattle moving through difficult terrain. He learned when to push forward and when to make camp. These practical lessons were worth more than any formal education on the Tennessee frontier. But when the drove reached its destination, David faced a choice: return home or seek his fortune. He chose adventure, working various jobs in Virginia before becoming homesick and making the long journey back to Tennessee on foot. The solo journey home, traveling hundreds of miles through wilderness and frontier settlements, was perhaps his true coming-of-age moment. His father had plans for David's education. John Crockett had debts, and one creditor agreed to cancel $36 of debt if David would attend school for 6 months. So at age 13, David Crockett entered his first and only formal schooling. He attended for about 4 days. On the 4th day, David got into a fight with another boy and, fearing punishment from both the schoolmaster and his father, he ran away from home. This moment defined much of his life. Throughout his career, David Crockett would react strongly to perceived humiliation or authority that seemed unjust. He had a stubborn independence that made him both admirable and difficult. For the next 2.5 years, David wandered, working odd jobs, driving wagons, and learning the skills of the frontier. He worked for farmers, learned to shoot, to hunt, to survive in the wilderness. He worked on farms, in mills, and anywhere else that would pay a young man willing to work hard. During these wandering years, David developed the skills that would define him. He became an exceptional marksman, learning to shoot with the long rifles used on the frontier. These weren't the accurate firearms of today. They were muzzle-loading weapons that required real skill to use effectively. A good shot could hit a target at 100 yards, and David became one of the best. He also learned to hunt. The Tennessee wilderness in the early 1800s was rich with game. Deer, bear, turkey, and smaller game were plentiful. Hunting wasn't sport, it was survival. Frontier families depended on hunters to provide meat. A good hunter was valuable, and David was becoming exceptional. When he finally returned home at 15, His father didn't recognize him. David had grown, matured, and transformed from a boy into a young man. He worked off his father's debts and, at age 18, began courting. David Crockett was not smooth with women. His first courtship ended in humiliation when the girl married someone else. His second attempt also failed, but in 1806, he met Polly Finley, and despite initial resistance from her parents, they married on August 14, 1806. Polly was, by all accounts, a practical, capable woman, exactly what a struggling frontiersman needed. Together, they started a farm in Tennessee and began having children. Their first son, John Wesley, was born in 1807, followed by William in 1809. David tried to be a farmer, but he wasn't particularly good at it. Farming required patience, planning, and consistent attention to crops and livestock. David had the work ethic but lacked the temperament. He was restless, always looking for the next opportunity, the next adventure. What he excelled at was hunting. The Tennessee wilderness was still rich with game, bear, deer, turkey. David could bring down a bear with a single shot, and he discovered he had a natural gift for it. He began spending more and more time in the woods, providing meat for his family and selling hides. Bear hunting in particular became Crockett's specialty. Black bears were common in the Tennessee mountains, and they were dangerous. A wounded bear could kill a man easily. But bear hunting was also profitable. Bear meat fed a family for weeks, and bear fat, rendered into oil, was valuable for cooking and lamp fuel. Bear hides brought good money. Crockett developed a method for bear hunting that combined patience, skill, and courage. He would track bears to their dens in winter when they were hibernating. Then, armed with his rifle and a knife, he would go into the den after them. This was incredibly dangerous. A cornered bear in a confined space could tear a man apart. But Crockett became expert at it. In one famous hunting season, Crockett later claimed to have killed over 100 bears. While this number might be exaggerated, it's clear he was an extraordinarily successful hunter. His reputation as a bear hunter spread throughout the region. But the wilderness that provided for the Crocketts also posed constant dangers. Encounters with bears were common and often deadly. David developed his reputation as a bear hunter during these years, though the stories were later wildly exaggerated. He didn't kill a bear at age 3. That was pure fiction. But he did become one of the most skilled hunters in the region. His hunting prowess brought some income, but the family remained poor. Farming was barely subsistent. David tried various schemes to make money, clearing land for others, running a grist mill, but nothing brought lasting success. The Crocketts moved frequently, always hoping the next piece of land would be better, always struggling to stay ahead of debt. In 1813, everything changed. The Creek War erupted as part of the larger conflict of the War of 1812. The Red Stick Creeks, inspired by the Shawnee leader Tecumseh, fought to resist American expansion into their lands. On August 30th, 1813, Creek warriors attacked Fort Mims in present-day Alabama, killing hundreds of settlers and mixed-race Creeks. The massacre at Fort Mims sent shockwaves through Tennessee. Volunteers were called up, and David Crockett enlisted as a scout under Major Francis Jones. He left behind Polly, their 2 young sons, and a farm that desperately needed tending. Why did Crockett enlist? Partly from a sense of duty and revenge for the Fort Mims massacre, partly because military service offered pay and the possibility of land bounties, and partly because it was what was expected of able-bodied men on the frontier. Not enlisting would have been seen as cowardice. Crockett served under Andrew Jackson, a relationship that would later become one of bitter political rivalry. As a scout, David was responsible for finding routes, locating enemy positions, and hunting to provide meat for the troops. He wasn't a frontline soldier in most engagements, but his role was crucial. The job of a scout required skills Crockett had developed over years of hunting. He could track through wilderness, read signs, and move silently. He could find game to feed the troops when supplies ran low, and he could navigate terrain that would have stymied others. He participated in several campaigns, including the brutal Battle of Tallushatchee in November 1813. The American forces, including Tennessee militia and Cherokee allies, attacked a Creek village, killing nearly 200 warriors. Crockett later wrote about the battle with unusual honesty, describing the horror of warfare and the sight of dead bodies, including women and children. In his autobiography, Crockett described finding a Creek woman dead in a house, with her infant still alive, trying to nurse from her body. He took the child to Creek prisoners and asked them to care for it, a moment of humanity in the midst of brutal warfare. Whether this story is true or embellished is unclear, but it shows how Crockett wanted to be remembered, as someone who could show mercy even in war. The campaigns were harsh. Soldiers marched through wilderness in winter, often without adequate supplies. They were hungry, cold, and exhausted. Disease killed as many men as combat. Crockett, used to frontier hardships, endured better than most. After his initial 3-month enlistment ended in December 1813, Crockett returned home briefly before re-enlisting in September 1814. He served until March 1815, missing the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, where Jackson decisively defeated the Red Sticks. Crockett's military service was competent, but not particularly distinguished. He didn't perform acts of legendary heroism. He was a good scout, a reliable hunter, and a soldier who did his duty. But this service gave him something valuable: connections, experience, and a taste for public life. He had served under officers who would become important political figures. He had seen how military glory translated into political power, and he had discovered he liked being part of something larger than himself. A barely literate bear hunter decides to run for Congress. His opponents mock him. The newspapers ridicule him. But Davy Crockett has a secret weapon that will make him one of the most famous politicians in America, and it's not what you think. When David Crockett returned from the Creek War in 1815, he returned to a life of farming and hunting. But tragedy struck that summer when Polly died, likely from illness. David was left alone with 3 young children: John Wesley, William, and Margaret. A frontiersman with young children needed a wife, and David needed one quickly. In 1816, he married Elizabeth Patton, a widow with 2 children of her own. Elizabeth brought something else to the marriage: property and a degree of financial stability. For the first time in his life, David Crockett had some economic security. They settled in Lawrence County, Tennessee, and David began to get involved in local affairs. He was appointed a magistrate and later a colonel in the local militia. These were his first steps into public life, and he discovered something surprising. People liked him. David Crockett had minimal education. He could barely write. His letters and even his autobiography required heavy editing. But he had something more valuable in frontier politics: charisma, humor, and an ability to connect with common people. In 1821, he decided to run for the Tennessee state legislature. His opponents were better educated, wealthier, and more experienced. But Crockett had a campaign strategy that was revolutionary for its time. He made himself entertaining. At political gatherings, called speakings, candidates would give formal addresses outlining their positions. Crockett would get up and tell hunting stories, make jokes, and relate to the audience as one of their own. He didn't pretend to be an intellectual. He leaned into his image as a rough frontiersman who understood their lives because he lived it himself. He won. Crockett served in the Tennessee legislature from 1821 to 1822 and again from 1823 to 1824. During this time, he began to develop his political philosophy. He wasn't particularly ideological, but he had strong convictions about certain issues: particularly land rights for poor settlers. The big land companies and wealthy speculators were buying up vast tracts of western Tennessee. Squatters, poor families who had cleared land and built homes but didn't have legal title, were being forced off. Crockett, who had been poor himself, championed legislation to protect squatters' rights and give them the ability to purchase the land they'd improved at reasonable prices. This put him at odds with wealthy interests, but it made him a hero to common farmers and frontiersmen. Crockett was building a base, though he probably didn't think of it in those terms. In 1825, Crockett decided to run for the U.S. House of Representatives. It was an audacious move. He was running against established politicians with money, education, and connections. But Crockett had learned how to campaign. He traveled across the district, attending every gathering, every barbecue, every court day. He told stories, made people laugh, and presented himself as the voice of the common man. He also wasn't afraid to mock his opponents in clever ways that made people remember him. In one famous incident, Crockett was scheduled to speak after his opponent, a lawyer who gave a long, eloquent speech. When Crockett's turn came, he said, "My opponent has made such a fine speech that I can't compete with it. But I'll tell you this, he reminds me of a fellow back home who could quote Shakespeare for hours but couldn't plow a straight furrow to save his life. Now, you folks decide who you'd rather have representing you in Washington, someone who can quote Shakespeare or someone who knows how to get things done." The crowd loved it. Crockett lost that election, but only narrowly. He ran again in 1827 and won, beginning his service in Congress in 1827. When David Crockett arrived in Washington, D.C. in December 1827, he was unlike any congressman who had come before. He wore frontier clothing, spoke with a thick accent, and had little patience for the formalities of congressional procedure. The Washington establishment didn't know what to make of him. Some mocked him as an uneducated buffoon. Others found him refreshingly honest. The newspapers covered him extensively, fascinated by this rough frontiersman in the halls of power. Crockett understood that his frontiersman image was an asset, and he played it up. He told stories in the halls of Congress, entertained at social gatherings, and made sure everyone knew he was different from the typical politician. In an age when most congressmen were lawyers or wealthy landowners, Crockett presented himself as the voice of the common man. But he also proved to be a surprisingly independent legislator. At this time, Andrew Jackson was rising to power, and most Tennessee politicians aligned themselves firmly with Old Hickory. Crockett had served under Jackson in the Creek War, and initially, he supported Jackson's 1828 presidential campaign. But Crockett refused to be anyone's rubber stamp. His primary focus in Congress was land reform. In western Tennessee and other frontier areas, there was a constant struggle over land ownership. Wealthy speculators and land companies bought up vast tracts, often through political connections or questionable deals. Meanwhile, poor families, squatters, cleared land, built homes, and farmed for years without legal title. When the land was eventually sold, these squatters were often forced off the land they had improved with their own labor. They lost everything they had worked for, while wealthy speculators profited from their improvements. Crockett saw this as fundamentally unjust. He introduced legislation to give Tennessee squatters the right to purchase their land at reduced rates, protecting them from being dispossessed. He argued passionately that the men who cleared the wilderness and made the land productive deserved to own it, not speculators who had never seen it. This put him in conflict with powerful interests. Land speculation was big business, and many of Jackson's political allies were involved in it. Crockett didn't care. He fought for his land reform bill with genuine passion, making speeches, lobbying colleagues, and refusing to compromise on what he saw as a matter of basic fairness. But Congress wasn't interested in protecting poor squatters. Crockett's bill was repeatedly blocked, amended into uselessness, or simply ignored. He became increasingly frustrated with the legislative process and with politicians who he felt cared more about wealthy interests than ordinary people. His frustration extended to Jackson's policies, particularly Jackson's treatment of Native Americans, and his expansion of executive power. When Jackson pushed for the Indian Removal Act in 1830, which would force southeastern tribes to relocate west of the Mississippi, Crockett was one of the few congressmen from the South to oppose it. This took real courage. Supporting Native American rights was deeply unpopular in Tennessee, where many voters wanted Indian lands opened for settlement. Crockett knew his vote might cost him his seat, but he cast it anyway. In a speech opposing Indian removal, Crockett argued that forcing the tribes from their ancestral lands was not only unjust, but unchristian. He pointed out that treaties had been signed guaranteeing the tribes their land, and that breaking those treaties damaged American honor. His speech was eloquent and passionate, showing a side of Crockett that contradicted his backwoods image. But it didn't matter. The Indian Removal Act passed overwhelmingly. The Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole tribes would be forced west on what became known as the Trail of Tears, with thousands dying along the way. Crockett had stood on principle and lost, and in Tennessee, his constituents were angry that he had voted against their interests. Crockett's opposition to Jackson made him a target. The Jackson political machine worked to destroy him. Pro-Jackson newspapers attacked him as a traitor to Tennessee. Opponents were recruited and funded to run against him. In 1831, Crockett lost his re-election bid. He returned to Tennessee bitter and angry, but he wasn't done with politics yet. In 1831, a group of wealthy businessmen in the North decided to create America's first manufactured celebrity. Their target? A failed congressman from Tennessee who could barely write his own name. What happened next would change American politics forever, and eventually cost Davy Crockett his life. While David Crockett nursed his wounds in Tennessee, powerful people in the Northeast were taking notice of him. The Whig Party, formed in opposition to Andrew Jackson's Democrats, saw potential in the rough-hewn congressman from the frontier. Jackson was immensely popular with common people. He was seen as a man of the people, a military hero who fought for ordinary Americans against elites. The Whigs, who generally represented business interests and the old establishment, desperately needed someone who could compete with Jackson's populist appeal. They found their answer in Davy Crockett. Crockett's opposition to Jackson was genuine, born from real policy disagreements. But the Whigs saw something more. A man who could be packaged, promoted, and turned into a counter-symbol to Jackson. Where Jackson was the general, Crockett could be the frontiersman. Where Jackson was the stern patriarch, Crockett could be the humorous everyman. In 1833, Crockett won back his congressional seat in a bitter campaign. But this time, he wasn't alone. Whig operatives began cultivating him, giving him speaking opportunities, introducing him to wealthy donors, and most importantly, helping to create a media image. In 1833, something unprecedented happened in American publishing: Sketches and Eccentricities of Call. David Crockett was published. It was allegedly written by James Strange French, but evidence suggests it was a collaborative effort involving Whig operatives. The book was filled with exaggerated tales of Crockett's adventures, presented in rough frontier dialect. It portrayed Crockett as a larger-than-life character who could outshoot, outfight, and outbrag anyone. Much of it was fiction or wild exaggeration, but it sold incredibly well. Crockett objected to some of the book's contents, claiming they made him look foolish. So, in 1834, he worked with Thomas Chilton, a Kentucky congressman, to produce a narrative of the life of David Crockett of the state of Tennessee. This was marketed as Crockett's authentic autobiography, written in his own words. In reality, Chilton did most of the writing, though it was based on Crockett's stories and dictation. The book was more measured than the earlier sketches, but it still played up Crockett's frontier credentials and positioned him as a voice of the common man against Jackson's tyranny. The autobiography was a bestseller. David Crockett was becoming famous in a way that no American politician had before. He wasn't just a congressman, he was a celebrity. In 1834, Crockett embarked on a tour of northeastern cities, ostensibly to promote his book, but really to serve as a Whig showcase against Jackson. He visited Philadelphia, New York, and Boston, appearing at rallies, dinners, and public events. The tour was a sensation. Huge crowds turned out to see the famous frontiersman. Wealthy Whigs hosted him at elaborate dinners. He was given gifts, including a fine rifle inscribed "Go Ahead," which became associated with his catchphrase. Newspapers covered his every move. Some praised him as a true American hero. Others, particularly Democratic papers, mocked him as a Whig puppet, an uneducated bumpkin being paraded around by cynical political operators. Both were partly right. Crockett enjoyed the attention and genuinely believed in his opposition to Jackson. But he was also being used. The Whigs didn't care about his land reform bills or his nuanced positions on policy. They wanted a symbol, a personality they could use to attack Jackson. Crockett was smart enough to know this, but he went along with it. The attention was intoxicating, and it gave him a platform. He convinced himself he could use the Whigs as much as they were using him. While the real David Crockett was giving speeches and serving in Congress, a fictional Davy Crockett was emerging in popular culture. Starting in the 1830s, almanacs bearing Crockett's name began appearing. These Crockett almanacs were filled with outrageous tall tales, Crockett riding alligators, fighting wild cats with his bare hands, grinning raccoons out of trees, and saving the earth by unfreezing the sun with bear grease. The stories were absurd, humorous, and wildly popular. Crockett had no control over these almanacs. They were published by various printers looking to cash in on his fame, but they created a mythological Davy Crockett that overshadowed the real man. The almanacs portrayed a Crockett who was superhuman, crude, violent, and impossibly skilled. He was a white supremacist hero of conquest, defeating Native Americans and wild animals with equal ease. The real Crockett's nuanced position on Indian removal was forgotten in these tales of frontier dominance. This fictional Crockett would outlive the real man by centuries. In Congress, Crockett's star was fading. His land reform bills went nowhere. His opposition to Jackson had made him enemies, but it hadn't made him effective. The Whigs praised him in public, but didn't actually support his legislative priorities. In 1835, Crockett faced another tough re-election campaign. His opponent, Adam Huntsman, was backed by the Jackson machine. The campaign was brutal, with both sides slinging mud. Huntsman mocked Crockett as a Whig tool who had abandoned Tennessee for northern cities. Crockett accused Huntsman of being a Jackson lackey. On Election Day, Crockett lost by a narrow margin. He was bitter, angry, and felt betrayed. In one of history's most famous political exit lines, Crockett reportedly told his constituents, "You may all go to hell, and I will go to Texas." Whether he actually said exactly that is debatable, but the sentiment was real. David Crockett, former congressman and American celebrity, was heading west to start over. He had no idea he was riding toward immortality. A washed-up politician arrives in Texas, looking for land and a fresh start. Within 3 months, he'll be dead, trapped in a mission with 200 other men, facing an army of thousands. But why was Davy Crockett really at the Alamo? The answer isn't what you learned in school. To understand why David Crockett went to Texas, you have to understand what Texas represented in 1835. Texas was part of Mexico, but it was filling up with American settlers. The Mexican government had encouraged immigration, offering cheap land to anyone who would settle, become Mexican citizens, and convert to Catholicism. Thousands of Americans took the offer, moving to Texas for the chance at land ownership they could never afford in the United States. By 1835, American settlers vastly outnumbered Mexican citizens in Texas. Tensions were rising over cultural differences, governance, and particularly over slavery. Mexico had abolished slavery, but many American settlers wanted to keep their slaves and resisted Mexican law. For someone like David Crockett, broke, politically defeated, and looking for a fresh start, Texas offered opportunity. Land was available. There was talk of Texas breaking away from Mexico and becoming independent, which would make early settlers wealthy landowners. There was also the possibility of military glory and political opportunity in a new republic. Crockett wasn't running away to become a fighter. He was running toward what he hoped would be a new chance at the success that had eluded him in Tennessee. In November 1835, David Crockett left Tennessee for Texas. He traveled with several companions, including his nephew William Patton and several young men from Tennessee looking for adventure. They traveled through Arkansas, hunting and camping along the way. Crockett wrote letters back home describing the journey and his hopes for the future. He was in good spirits, optimistic about what lay ahead. As they traveled, they heard news about the growing conflict in Texas. The Texas Revolution had begun in October 1835. Texian settlers, as American Texans called themselves, were rebelling against Mexican authority, particularly against the centralist government of General Antonio Ilpez de Santa Anna. Initial reports suggested the Texians were winning easily. At the Battle of Gonzales, Texian militia had defeated Mexican troops. The Texian army had captured San Antonio de Psar, including a former Spanish mission called the Alamo. The revolution looked like it might be over quickly, with Texas winning independence without much of a fight. This made Texas even more attractive to Crockett. Get in early on a successful revolution, and you could end up with land, position, and influence in a new republic. Crockett arrived in Nacogdoches, Texas, on January 9, 1836. He took an oath of allegiance to the Provisional Government of Texas, swearing to support a future Texas Constitution. In exchange, he was promised land, a lot of land. Volunteers who fought for Texas would receive 4,600 acres. For a man who had spent his life struggling with debt and land titles, this was an incredible opportunity. Crockett could have stayed in Nacogdoches or traveled to the Texian government headquarters. Instead, he headed to San Antonio, arriving around February 8, 1836. Why did he go to the Alamo specifically? The historical record isn't entirely clear, but several factors likely influenced his decision. First, William Travis, the commander at the Alamo, was actively recruiting volunteers. The Alamo garrison was undermanned and needed reinforcements. Second, San Antonio was the most important military position in Texas. Whoever controlled it controlled access to settlements in the east. If Crockett wanted to be where the action was, the Alamo made sense. Third, Crockett may have believed that holding the Alamo would be a short assignment before the Texian army regrouped for a spring campaign. He wouldn't be stuck there forever. Finally, Crockett was still thinking politically. Being part of a successful defense of San Antonio would give him credibility and fame in the new Texas Republic. He could leverage that into land, position, maybe even political office. What he didn't know, what almost no one knew, was that Santa Anna was marching north with a massive army determined to crush the Texas Rebellion, once and for all. The Alamo was a former Spanish mission, secularized and partially fortified. It was never designed to be a fortress. The walls were crumbling in places. The compound was too large to defend effectively with a small force, and it lacked adequate supplies. The garrison consisted of about 200 men. Estimates vary from 180 to 250. They were a mixed group: Texian volunteers, Tejanos, Mexican Texans fighting for independence, adventurers from the United States, and a few professional soldiers. The commanders were James Bowie, famous for his knife and his land speculation schemes, and William Travis, a young lawyer who had fled to Texas to escape debts and a failed marriage. Bowie was popular with the men but was ill, possibly with typhoid or tuberculosis. Travis was the official commander but lacked Bowie's charisma. David Crockett arrived with his Tennessee volunteers and was welcomed. He was by far the most famous person in the Alamo, a former congressman, author, and celebrity. But he wasn't given a command position. He was 49 years old, older than most of the defenders, and his military experience was limited to his time as a scout in the Creek War over 20 years earlier. Instead, Crockett and his Tennessee boys were assigned to defend the palisade, a wooden fence that ran between the church and the low barracks, one of the weakest points in the Alamo's defenses. On February 23, 1836, Santa Anna's army arrived in San Antonio. The garrison at the Alamo was caught off guard. They had expected Mexican forces to arrive in March, if at all, but Santa Anna had pushed his troops hard through winter weather, determined to strike quickly. The Mexican army numbered somewhere between 1,800 and 6,000 troops, depending on which historical estimates you believe. They vastly outnumbered the Alamo garrison. Travis immediately sent out calls for help. He wrote letters begging for reinforcements, including his famous victory or death letter addressed to the people of Texas and all Americans in the world. In it, he wrote, "I shall never surrender or retreat. I call on you in the name of liberty, of patriotism, and everything dear to the American character, to come to our aid with all dispatch." Victory or death. It was stirring rhetoric, but help was slow in coming. The Texian army, under Sam Houston, was still organizing. Other garrisons were undermanned. The men in the Alamo were largely on their own. The defenders settled in for a siege. Mexican artillery began bombarding the Alamo, though the primitive cannons did limited damage to the thick adobe walls. The defenders returned fire, making the Mexicans pay for every approach. The siege established a grim routine. Mexican artillery would bombard the walls during the day. Defenders would repair damage at night. Both sides conserved ammunition, firing only when there was a clear target. Food supplies began to run low. Water was rationed. What was David Crockett doing during the siege? We don't have much first-hand testimony, but we have some clues. According to some accounts, Crockett's primary role was as a sharpshooter. Stationed at the palisade with his Tennessee long rifle, he picked off Mexican soldiers who got too close. The palisade was a vulnerable position, a wooden fence between the church and the low barracks. It wasn't as strong as the stone walls, and it would be one of the first positions to fall when the final assault came. But Crockett and his Tennessee volunteers defended it throughout the siege. Other accounts suggest he also served as a morale booster. He was known for his fiddle playing and storytelling. During the 13-day siege, as supplies ran low and hope faded, Crockett may have entertained the defenders, keeping spirits up with music and tales. One account, from a Mexican officer's diary, describes hearing fiddle music from the Alamo at night. If true, it was likely Crockett, playing defiant tunes while surrounded by an army. It's a powerful image, a condemned man playing music in the face of death. The defenders knew their situation was desperate, but they held on to hope. Surely reinforcements would come. Surely the main Texian army would arrive. Surely they wouldn't be abandoned. But, as days passed and no help came, that hope began to fade. The men talked among themselves. Some wanted to try to escape, to slip through Mexican lines at night and reach the Texian army. Others insisted they should hold the Alamo to buy time for Texas to organize its defense. Travis reportedly drew a line in the sand with his sword and asked all who would stay to cross it. According to legend, all but one man crossed. This story is probably apocryphal. It first appeared in accounts written decades later. But it captures something true about the mood in the Alamo. The men knew they were probably doomed, but they chose to stay anyway. By early March, the situation was desperate. Despite Travis's pleas, significant reinforcements hadn't arrived. On March 1, 32 men from Gonzales managed to slip through Mexican lines and join the garrison, but it wasn't nearly enough. The defenders knew they were likely doomed. Santa Anna had raised a red flag, indicating no quarter would be given. There would be no surrender, no prisoners. It was victory or death, just as Travis had written. On March 5, Santa Anna called a council of war with his officers. Some argued for continuing the siege, starving the defenders out. But Santa Anna was impatient. He ordered an assault for the next morning, before the Texian army could gather reinforcements. The men in the Alamo had one last night. What did David Crockett think about during those final hours? Did he regret coming to Texas? Did he think about his children back in Tennessee? Did he pray? Or did he simply clean his rifle and prepare for what was coming? We'll never know. He left no final letter, no journal entry. David Crockett faced his last night in silence. March 6, 1836. Before sunrise, 1,800 Mexican soldiers prepare to storm the Alamo. Inside, 200 defenders ready themselves for the final battle. What happened in the next 90 minutes has been debated, lied about, and mythologized for nearly 200 years. Here's what really happened, and why the truth about Davy Crockett's death was hidden for over a century. At approximately 5 p.m. on March 6, 1836, in the pre-dawn darkness, Santa Anna's army began its assault on the Alamo. Over 1,800 Mexican soldiers advanced in 4 columns toward different sections of the walls. The defenders were exhausted from 13 days of siege, low on ammunition, and outnumbered nearly 10-1. But they fought fiercely. The Mexican army suffered heavy casualties in the initial assault. Texian rifles and cannons cut down soldiers as they approached the walls. The first wave was repulsed, soldiers falling back in disarray. But Santa Anna ordered them forward again. The second wave brought ladders and crowbars. Mexican soldiers began scaling the walls and prying at weak points. The sheer weight of numbers began to tell. At the north wall, Mexican soldiers breached the defenses. At the palisade, where David Crockett and his Tennessee volunteers were stationed, the wooden fence couldn't hold against the assault. Mexican troops poured through. Once the Mexicans breached the walls, the battle became a desperate, hand-to-hand fight. The defenders retreated to the long barracks and the church, fighting room by room. It was brutal, close-quarters combat with rifles, pistols, knives, and clubbed muskets. The entire battle lasted about 90 minutes. By sunrise, it was over. Every defender was dead. For 150 years, the official story was that David Crockett died fighting, surrounded by Mexican corpses, his rifle used as a club after he ran out of ammunition. This is the version immortalized in movies, books, and folklore, but it's probably not true. In 1975, a document surfaced that changed everything. It was the diary of José Enrique de la Pey, a Mexican officer who participated in the assault. In it, de la Pey described what happened after the battle. According to de la Pey, 7 defenders were captured alive after the fighting ended, including David Crockett. They were brought before Santa Anna. Some officers pleaded for their lives to be spared, arguing they should be treated as prisoners of war. Santa Anna refused. He ordered them executed immediately. Despite protests from several officers, soldiers bayoneted and killed the prisoners in front of Santa Anna. According to de la Pey's account, Crockett died not in battle, but as a prisoner, executed after surrendering or being captured. The publication of de la Pey's diary caused enormous controversy. Many people, particularly in Texas, refused to believe it. They argued the diary was a forgery, or that de la Pey was mistaken, or that it dishonored Crockett's memory. But most historians now accept that de la Pey's account is likely accurate. It's corroborated by other Mexican sources and makes logical sense. In the chaos of the final assault, with Mexican soldiers pouring through breaches from multiple directions, some defenders were likely captured alive. Does this make Crockett a coward? Absolutely not. He fought in a hopeless battle, stayed when he could have left, and faced death with courage. Whether he died with a rifle in his hands or before a firing squad doesn't change his bravery. It only changes the myth. But the myth mattered to people. They wanted Crockett to die a hero's death, fighting to the last. The idea that he was captured and executed was harder to accept, even though it required equal courage. Santa Anna ordered the bodies of the defenders burned. They were stacked in piles with wood and set alight. The fire burned for days. Santa Anna thought the Alamo would break the Texas Rebellion. Instead, it galvanized it. Remember, the Alamo became the rallying cry for the Texian army. At the Battle of San Jacinto on April 21, 1836, Sam Houston's army defeated Santa Anna's forces in 18 minutes, securing Texas independence. News of the Alamo reached the United States in late March. The reports were fragmentary, confused, and often wrong, but they all agreed on one thing: David Crockett was dead. The newspapers exploded with coverage. The famous frontiersman, former congressman, and American celebrity had died at the Alamo. The stories quickly turned him into a martyr for liberty and freedom. Plays were written about his death, songs composed, books published. The myth of Davy Crockett dying heroically at the Alamo was born almost immediately, and it proved far more powerful than the real complicated man had ever been in life. In the decades after the Alamo, the Crockett legend grew. The almanacs continued to be published, filled with increasingly outrageous tales. Crockett became a symbol of the American frontier, of rugged individualism, of standing up to tyranny. In 1841, the play The Lion of the West featured a Crockett-like character. In the 1870s and 1880s, dime novels featured Davy Crockett as a hero. Each generation reinvented him to fit their needs. The Crockett legend served different purposes at different times. In the 1840s and 1850s, he represented manifest destiny, the idea that Americans were destined to expand across the continent. Stories emphasized his role in conquering the wilderness and defeating Native Americans. During the Civil War, both North and South claimed Crockett. Southerners pointed to his death defending Texas. Northerners emphasized his opposition to Jackson and his independent spirit. The real Crockett's complexity was lost as he became a symbol for competing causes. In the late 19th century, as the frontier closed and America industrialized, Crockett represented a vanishing way of life. He became nostalgic, a symbol of a simpler time when men were free and the wilderness was unconquered. Buffalo Bill's Wild West shows included Crockett-like characters, blending history and entertainment. The 20th century brought new versions. In the 1950s, Walt Disney created a Davy Crockett television series starring Fess Parker. It was a massive hit, sparking a merchandising craze. Kids across America wore coonskin caps and sang the Ballad of Davy Crockett. The Disney series introduced Crockett to a generation that knew nothing about the real man. Disney's version was sanitized for 1950s family television. Brave, honest, always doing the right thing. He fought for justice, protected the weak, and died heroically at the Alamo. He was a perfect hero for the Cold War era, representing American values and courage. The series created a Crockett craze unlike anything before. In 1955, stores couldn't keep coonskin caps in stock. Crockett lunchboxes, toys, games, and comic books flooded the market. It's estimated that sales of Crockett-related merchandise exceeded $100 million in 1955 alone, an enormous sum for that era. But this wasn't David Crockett. It was Davy Crockett, the myth. And the myth had completely overtaken reality. Later films took different approaches. John Wayne played Crockett in The Alamo in 1960, presenting him as a more complex character who questions the wisdom of the battle while staying to fight. Billy Bob Thornton portrayed him in The Alamo in 2004, showing a more historically accurate, flawed Crockett, who drinks, gambles, and isn't sure why he's in Texas. Each version reflected its era. The Disney Crockett was perfect for the optimistic 1950s. Wayne's Crockett fit the 1960s, when Americans were beginning to question authority and heroic narratives. Thornton's Crockett matched the 21st century's preference for ambiguous heroes and historical accuracy. Through it all, the basic outline remained: frontier hero, congressman, defender of the Alamo. But the details shifted to fit what each generation needed Crockett to represent. The real David Crockett was more interesting than the myth, but also more flawed. He was a man who struggled with poverty, failed at farming, used his celebrity for political gain, and ended up in Texas partly because he was broke and out of options. He was also genuinely brave, surprisingly principled on some issues like Native American rights, and capable of real courage in standing up to Andrew Jackson when it would have been easier to go along. What should we make of David Crockett's life and death? First, he was a product of his time and place. The frontier was brutal, violent, and often unjust. Crockett participated in the dispossession of Native Americans, even as he occasionally spoke out against it. He was a slaveholder who went to Texas partly to defend slavery, even though he also had moments of surprising moral clarity. Second, he was one of America's first celebrities, and his experience shows both the power and the danger of fame. Crockett's celebrity gave him opportunities and a platform, but it also trapped him. He became a symbol, and symbols are hard to escape. Third, his story reveals how quickly myth can overtake reality. Within years of his death, the real David Crockett was buried under layers of legend. Most Americans know Davy Crockett, the mythical bear-fighting frontiersman. Very few know David Crockett, the complicated, flawed, but ultimately courageous man. Fourth, the controversy over how he died reminds us that we often care more about how stories make us feel than about truth. The myth of Crockett dying in battle serves a purpose. It gives us a hero, a symbol of resistance and courage. The reality of him being executed as a prisoner is messier, more uncomfortable, but no less brave. Today, Crockett's legacy is visible across America. Counties, towns, and streets bear his name. The Alamo is one of the most visited historical sites in the United States. Movies continue to tell his story, though they usually prefer the myth to the man. In Tennessee, his home state, he remains a beloved figure. In Texas, he's honored as a hero of independence. But both places remember Davy Crockett, the legend, more than David Crockett, the man. Perhaps that's inevitable. Myths serve purposes that reality can't. We need heroes, symbols, and simple stories. But we also lose something when we forget the real people behind the legends. David Crockett was a frontiersman in an age of expansion, a politician in an era of democratic transformation, and a man caught between reality and myth. He wasn't perfect. He made mistakes, he was used by others, and he sometimes used his fame selfishly. But he also showed real courage, not just at the Alamo, but in Congress when he voted against Indian removal, despite knowing it would hurt him politically. He showed integrity in breaking with Andrew Jackson when it would have been easier to stay silent. And he showed the kind of bravery at the Alamo that comes from knowing you're probably going to die and staying anyway. That's worth remembering, even if it's not as simple as grinning a coon out of a tree. Why does David Crockett still matter nearly 200 years after his death? Because his life and death encapsulate something essential about American mythology and American reality. He was the common man who rose to prominence, the frontiersman who went to Congress, the celebrity who died for a cause. But he was also a man who struggled with poverty and debt, who made compromises and mistakes, who was manipulated by political forces beyond his control, and who died in a battle that was probably avoidable. Both stories are true. Both are important. The myth of Davy Crockett tells us what Americans want to believe about themselves: that we're brave, independent, and willing to fight for freedom. That's a powerful and important story. The reality of David Crockett tells us something more complicated but equally important: that heroism is messy, that courage doesn't require perfection, and that real people are always more interesting than their legends. In the end, maybe the best way to honor David Crockett is to remember both versions: the myth and the man. The myth inspires us, the man teaches us, and both remind us that history is never as simple as we'd like it to be. You've been taught the legend your whole life. But now you know the truth about David Crockett, the real man behind the myth. A man who was braver, more complex, and more interesting than any tall tale could ever capture. The question is, which version will you remember? David Crockett died at the Alamo on March 6, 1836. He was 49 years old. Davy Crockett, the myth, the legend, the symbol, was just being born. The real man was buried in the ashes of the Alamo, his bones mixed with those of his fellow defenders, impossible to separate or identify. But his legend would live on in almanacs and plays, novels and films, songs and stories. He would become whatever America needed him to be: frontier hero, political symbol, marketing tool, historical martyr. Each generation would recreate him in their own image. But underneath all the legends, there was still David Crockett, a man who killed his first bear at a young age, though not 3, who couldn't write well but could tell a story brilliantly, who loved his children but left them to chase opportunity, who stood up to the most powerful man in America. On principle, and who died in a foreign land fighting for a cause he'd adopted only weeks before. That man, flawed, complex, courageous, and human, is worth remembering. Nearly 200 years after his death, David Crockett remains a figure of fascination. Books continue to be written about him. Historians debate the details of his life and death. His name appears on schools, streets, and parks across America. Why does he endure when so many of his contemporaries have been forgotten? Part of it is the dramatic nature of his death. The Alamo is one of the most famous battles in American history, and Crockett's presence there guaranteed his immortality. Dying in battle, especially in a losing battle, creates a powerful narrative that resonates across generations. But there's more to it than that. Crockett represents something fundamental about American mythology: the idea that an ordinary person can rise to greatness through courage, wit, and determination. He wasn't born wealthy or privileged. He had minimal education. He failed at farming and business. Yet he became a congressman and a legend. This is a story Americans want to believe: that birth and status don't determine destiny, that anyone can achieve greatness, that courage and principle matter more than money or power. Of course, this narrative isn't entirely true. Crockett benefited from being a white man in an era of expansion. His rise came partly at the expense of Native Americans being displaced. His political career was manipulated by wealthy interests, and his death in Texas was in service of a rebellion partly motivated by the desire to preserve slavery. But myths aren't about complete truth. They're about the truths we choose to emphasize. And Americans have chosen to emphasize Crockett's independence, his opposition to authority, his connection to the common people, and his courage in the face of death. There's a danger in mythologizing historical figures. When we turn people into symbols, we lose the complexity that makes them human. We miss the lessons that come from understanding their failures and moral compromises. The Davy Crockett of legend, the man who can grin a coon out of a tree, who never missed a shot, who died fighting to the last, teaches us very little. He's too perfect, too superhuman. We can admire him, but we can't learn from him because we can't relate to him. The David Crockett of history, who struggled with poverty and debt, who failed at farming, who was used by political parties, who made compromises, who voted for what he believed was right even when it hurt him politically, teaches us much more. He shows us that courage doesn't require perfection, that principle matters even in defeat, and that ordinary people can take extraordinary stands. The myth also obscures uncomfortable truths. The romantic vision of Crockett as a frontier hero ignores the violence and injustice of westward expansion. The emphasis on his death at the Alamo for Texas freedom glosses over the fact that many Texas rebels were fighting to preserve slavery against a Mexican government that had abolished it. These complexities don't make Crockett worthless as a historical figure. They make him more interesting and more relevant. Understanding the full context of his life helps us understand our own history more honestly. If we look past the myth to the man, what can we learn from David Crockett's life? First, that integrity has costs. Crockett's opposition to Indian removal and his breaks with the Jackson machine hurt his political career. He could have gone along, stayed in Congress, avoided conflict, but he chose principle over pragmatism, even knowing it would hurt him. That's a rare quality in any era. Second, that fame and celebrity can be both empowering and corrupting. Crockett's celebrity gave him opportunities and a platform, but it also made him a tool for others, shaped his image in ways he couldn't control, and possibly led him to Texas seeking to reclaim the fame he'd lost. Celebrity is powerful, but it's not the same as genuine achievement or worth. Third, that people are complicated. Crockett could show mercy to a Creek infant in the middle of a brutal war, yet he also participated in the violent dispossession of native peoples. He could vote against Indian removal on principle, yet he owned slaves and went to Texas partly to defend slavery. He could be brave at the Alamo, yet he was also broke, politically defeated, and looking for a fresh start. All of these things can be true simultaneously. Finally, that how we're remembered isn't always in our control. Crockett couldn't have imagined becoming a Disney character or a symbol for Cold War American values. The myth that grew up around him had little to do with who he actually was. This is both humbling and freeing. We can't control our legacy, so we might as well focus on living according to our principles. Because in the end, we don't need Davy Crockett, the mythical Superman who could grin a coon out of a tree. We need David Crockett, the real man who showed us that ordinary people can do extraordinary things, that courage doesn't require perfection, and that standing up for what you believe in matters, even when you know you might lose. That's a legacy worth preserving. That's a story worth telling. That's the real Davy Crockett, and he's far more interesting than the legend ever was.